Hello, everybody, and welcome to the G4A show. This is episode 107. If you have never watched us before, hello, welcome. My name is Jordan. I am always here, apart from last week when we had no episode. So apologies for that. But as you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, that does mean we now have a double bill of Jeff, the Analog Stick Gamer from analogstickgaming.com. How are you, Jeff?
Oh, I'm not doing too bad. Pretty decent.
Good. You're on the sofa today, so
Yeah,
that's a
my back is
different
killing
background
me.
for us.
Oh, the chair I sit in is not the greatest. But no, back is just bugging me. So I figure I'm just gonna chill out where I play games.
Chill out.
So,
Well, this is a nice chilled out episode. We're gonna have a little bit of a war. If you've seen the title of the episode, you know that means we're gonna talk JRPGs versus Western RPGs. The reason we're doing it this way is because we kind of wanted to cover both genres anyway. And I, as a more recent fan of JRPGs, don't know as many. And therefore, Jeff is bringing the JRPGs today. And I am bringing the Western RPGs. And we're going to kind of have a discussion about which are some of the great ones in each genre, which type of RPG we prefer and what they do better than each other, that kind of thing. So if you've got any comments on that, please leave them on the YouTube or, hit us up on Twitter. Our links will be in the description because we always like to discuss these things with people. But before that, as always, Jeff, I think we should talk about what we've been playing. And I know that you have been playing a few things you can't talk about yet, of course. But have you been playing anything you can talk about?
yeah. I mean, the bulk of my time has really just been with Xenoblade Chronicles 3.
Okay.
Like
Talking about
it's
JRPGs.
literally right next to me here. I've got about 75 hours in, and I mean,
Nice.
I'd have more, but I mean, again, I'm full-time job and I'm also reviewing a bunch of other stuff as well too. But yeah, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 right now, and I don't see it changing, is easily my game of the year.
Wow.
It is
Over Elden Ring.
unbelievably good. Like, Elden Ring is a fantastic game. Do not get me wrong. It is amazing. But there are times in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 where I'm like, this is so good. And then it just keeps getting better.
Wow.
And it's fantastic. I know there's been a lot of discourse around the visuals, that people are wishing it was on a system more powerful than the Switch, but the reality is the Switch is a handheld.
Yeah.
You can attach it to a dock to play it on the TV.
And also what it's able to get out of a handheld machine
Yeah.
in terms of how good it looks. Like, I haven't played it,
And
but
how
I've
old
seen
it
it,
is.
and it looks
This
amazing,
is
right?
what, 5-year-old hardware, 4-year-old hardware.
Yeah.
And Monolith has done a Monolith Soft, I think is what it is.
Yeah, Monolith Soft.
I get them mis
Productions is the WB studio.
Yeah. What they've managed to do in the short time since the last one, because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Torna Country, whatever, was not that long ago. And they've also been working on Breath of the Wild 2. Like, they're the support studio for that game as well. So this is a fantastic studio, and they've done such a good job with this game. Like, personally, I think it's gorgeous from an aesthetic point of view. Yeah, sure. There's blurry textures. There's some, pop in of where grass is growing as you're moving around, but none of that stuff.
And the other thing is, if you're playing in handheld mode, like you're saying, the Switch is essentially a handheld. Yes, you can play it on your TV, and yes, it is a tiny bit more powerful if you plug it into the dock in terms of you'll get higher resolution or whatever. But first and foremost, it's designed to be used as a handheld.
Well, yeah, because the entire unit, like the thing itself, is essentially the Switch, right? It is there. Yeah. I mean, you get things like the Steam Deck, which is new hardware. Of course, it's going to run better, and Steam is taking a massive loss on cost.
Yeah.
Making
and I mean,
Nintendo isn't.
I mean, I've got a Steam Deck and I love it, and it very clearly is a much more powerful handheld, right? But also the price difference between those two machines is astronomical. Like,
Yeah, and Nintendo's making a profit on their Switch.
yeah,
Steam is like hemorrhaging money essentially selling the Steam Deck.
yeah,
So there is a huge disconnect in terms of that aspect of
absolutely.
it. But
I think it obviously, to take a little tangent as we love to do here on the show, I think it does bring up a discussion that's worth having about whether Nintendo do in some way need to push for a little bit more power next
I
time
think you'll
around.
get that on their next hardware.
Mhm.
I don't see them doing a revision. I think they would have done it already. And I think the market in terms of like how COVID's affected parts and all that kind of stuff,
Absolutely.
I don't
Absolutely.
think we're going to get a revision. But back on Xenoblade,
Yes.
Xenoblade is really fantastic. The characters are great. I love not hearing the same five voice actors embody these characters, so that they can actually have voice actors, so they can actually have voices embody these characters. Um, yeah, the character moments are fantastic. The action is so well framed. Like there are some cutscenes in this game that just get you hyped for a boss battle. There's been a couple moments where I didn't see something coming, like moments where you're just literally gasping and going, "What the hell?" And it's fantastic. The combat system is super engaging. The side quests actually mean something. Yeah, there is your typical fetch quests. They've corrected a lot of that with these things called collectopedia cards, which is like, I need 15 of these things, and then you find them, and then you just hit enter, essentially, and you submit them. You don't have to head back to them. But the side quests are fantastic. They have these things called hero quests, which are kind of like side quests, but they get you an extra hero, which then unlocks another subclass for you.
Oh, okay.
And those quests are incredibly well done. Like this is a lot of them are around like the whole game's themes are essentially around like death and life, rebirth, all that kind of stuff. And they do a fantastic job explaining all of this kind of stuff. And those side quests really contribute towards that stuff, towards how the story is formatted, because these are like two opposing factions that are essentially wiping each other out to collect the life source of their defeated.
Yeah.
And it does such a fantastic job. Like this is an absolute masterpiece from top to bottom. The
Nice.
soundtrack is amazing. The voice acting is extremely well done. I love the script. I love the story, the characters, everything.
I mean, when I have some time, I may try and get around to the game, but I'm very busy right now to the point where,
Yeah,
I said on the last episode that I didn't even have time to play video games, which is unusual for me.
yeah.
Um, um, but it does seem like a very special game, and it seems like one that's actually grabbing people, which is nice to see from a series that has now had a couple of entries and has always been great from what I can tell, but hasn't really exploded in any kind of
Yeah,
way.
it's
Whereas,
technically its fifth entry if you take it at in terms of like how many titles they've had, because they've had Xenoblade Chronicles X, which I'm really hoping for a Switch port. It's a Wii
okay,
U game, so literally they just have to put it through that same machine. Um, and then Torna Country, which is the spinoff to two.
okay. So yeah, it's I don't know. Like I'm not surprised, is what I would say about what you've been saying about the game and how great it is, because that's always the impression that I've got about these games anyway. But it is nice to see, and I see online a lot of people discussing this game, and it seems like it really is breaking out. And I always like to see that from any developer when they finally have their kind of breakout moment where people in the wider audience start paying attention. It's always nice to see that sort of stuff. So, with all that being said about that game, before I move on to a couple of things that I have been playing, does that mean it's going to turn up later in the episode in your list?
I mean, briefly, I've already sung its praises, is back its forth and stuff, because like I love two. Two is fantastic. I love those characters, Pyra and Mithra and Rex and all those characters. But three just does the interpersonal relationships between these characters in ways where I wasn't like when I saw the first trailers, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like these characters, like this character and that, and now I'm like, I would die for them. They are amazing.
I love that when you think that you're not going to like a character or characters, and then actually, because of the way they're handled in a game,
Yeah.
you end up connecting with them in such a different way. I actually had that with a very different type of game, The Quarry, which was something, released a couple of months ago, and very much enjoyed it. And actually, at the start of the game, I didn't really like a lot of the characters,
Oh,
but
I couldn't wait to kill half of them.
but
I was like, you're done. I'm like, if you're not Brenda Song, like Brenda Song's on this side, everyone's on this side. I'm like, all right, dig your
but
graves.
but by the end, I genuinely cared about a lot of these characters because they took, and if you don't know what The Quarry is, it's obviously a horror game from Supermassive. They're great at that kind of stuff, but it's very tropey, right? As they always do.
Yeah.
And in these kind of games, that's not a bad thing. But what they did that was quite clever with this game, I think, was how they took some tropes and they made you expect certain characters to be a certain way, and then they gave them more depth. So I forget the character's name, but there's that one character who's kind of like a jock style guy, but then actually he's got a lot
Jake,
of, yeah, but then
Jacob
he's
or
got a lot
something.
of emotional things about him that you don't expect from that kind of character.
Yeah.
Um, and then there was like Dylan, who, spoilers for The Quarry if you haven't played it, you cut his arm off at one point. um, and
I
it's
mean, you
like,
can. I think you can. I think you can choose not to, but
yeah, and it's, so I just loved being able to kind of connect with the characters over the course of the game. So I understand what you're saying there about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and about how you weren't sure that you were going to connect with these characters based on the trailers and things. But then
mhm.
actually, when you play the game and you see the way these characters are handled and how they grow over the course of the game and how their
Yeah.
relationships grow, I totally get what you mean.
And I
Um,
love like the voice acting also leads itself into being like I think they have like a bunch of Welsh actors, a bunch of British actors, and it leads into that speak as well too. So it isn't just like you have a British actor reading an American script. They have all of the like Britishisms and stuff like that. Like this is one
nice.
of the first games where I've actually noticed them saying in it like probably 40 times. So it's nice to see them like actually embrace the script that they're given.
That's a very British thing, right?
I
I'm
didn't
sure.
I never even heard it really until like Raul Coley kept saying it like a billion times, and then all of a sudden I hear it everywhere, and I'm like, you just get that entry point into in certain languages from like one source, and it just
and
then you
then you
suddenly
and
hear it
then you
everywhere.
notice it all the time, right? Yeah,
It was there
absolutely.
all along.
Um, so for me, I haven't played too much. I've been playing something that I can't talk about. Um, and then last night I decided to finally jump into Power Wash Simulator for about
So
3 hours,
so
and
good.
it's amazing. I don't even like. I get it, but it has no right to be as good as it is. like,
No, I
like,
know. Like my roommate's playing it now too. Let's walk up, and I'm like, "Oh, did you get the achievement there?" I'm like, "Yeah."
it genuinely has no right. Like, I don't. They've just, and I think these types of simulator games have found their audience at this point. I think of. Sorry if you can hear some noise outside. Someone's working outside, so apologies. Um, but I think that, things like House Flipper, for example, and now this are almost like relaxation games. Wouldn't you agree, Jeff? I know you've played a bit of Power
Yeah,
Wash.
like the thing about this one is you get something like cooking simulator, and you'll make like I don't know a burger or a dish or a salad or whatever, and then send it on its way. But it doesn't feel like you're really accomplishing anything. So when you make these small meals, it doesn't feel like satisfying. But when you're cleaning like something and you see that beginning and you see that end, there is a progression level of that game that feels satisfying, that you've actually done something. So I think it taps into that kind of like, like that type of like, I don't know, like lizard brain kind of thing where you're like,
Yeah.
this is so satisfying.
And I also think, do you know what, weirdly, I think that gamers actually like to do real life things in video games.
Well,
Like,
yeah, you get Animal Crossing, Sims, like all that kind of stuff is wildly successful.
yeah, and I think it's so interesting to me that, for some people, their escape in terms of video games is to go and do things in video games that they could do in real life, but in real life they don't like doing those things. Like, realistically, who's going to go around power washing stuff? Do you know what I mean? Who actually
I don't know,
wants
I'm
to
kind
do
of
that?
tempted now. You give me a power wash and I might do it. Let's put on a good podcast.
So I've played that. I played about 3 hours of that, and that was enjoyable. And I definitely will play more of it. Like, I think it's my new chill out game for now.
Yeah.
It's just gonna kind of be, yeah, it will be there, and I'll pick up and play it now and then, do 1 or 2 levels. I was washing a bike last night, and I got to the point where I couldn't find this one little bit of the bike that I hadn't sprayed yet. And it was like, that was a little bit frustrating because it took me about 5 minutes to find this one little part of the bike.
Yeah.
And I think there are some accessibility things they could do to kind of improve the game, but I don't think they're doing bad at all. You can press the button to kind of highlight where the dirt is and see the dirt in that way. But
yeah, and you have the auto spray as well too, so you just kind of have to point the nozzle.
Yeah, so there's a couple of good accessibility things in those terms, but I actually think there is a little bit more they could have potentially done there. Things like having the dirt be a different color all the time, so being able to set, being able to set options. A color, and those kind of things. But obviously, that's part of it, right? And sometimes these things are just too difficult or whatever to include, and that's not what we want to hear, of course. Me having a disability myself, like, we want accessibility options in these games, and sometimes I think that we're still in this phase where games don't necessarily think about accessibility options while they're making the game. And we've seen quite a few games now add them after the fact. And
they'll hire consultants essentially to kind of work with them right from the get-go.
Yeah. And, that would be my hope for something like Power Wash Simulator. It's like, now that a lot of people are playing this game because it's on Game Pass.
And it's published by Square Enix, of all people.
I would hope that they're going to go and add some accessibility to the game, because I think this is a game that a lot more people would enjoy than that. Like, it's one of those where you'll think, I'm not going to enjoy this, but actually when you play it, there is something super satisfying about that gameplay loop. And I played it where I just had my Spotify music playing in the background. I turned off the video game music.
Yeah.
And I played my own music, and I was just playing the game for like 2.5, 3 hours. Loved it. Other than that, I'm kind of preparing to play a lot of games right now. I'm kind of, I'm looking at games and I'm like, what do I want to play next? And I am intrigued by Saints Row.
Yeah, I've got that pre-ordered.
Which is coming out obviously next week at time of recording.
22nd, yeah.
So that's going to be interesting to see. I mean, for me, it's one of those things where I'm not sure I'm expecting a great game, but I am expecting a game that fills a hole. Do you know what I mean? That fills a gap in the market right now. and it's the kind of game that I want to play. Like, it just looks like crazy fun. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it looks basically like if if you were to give a face to like a 7 or an 8.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
I don't see any outlet giving it higher than an 8.
No, I don't
It
think
just
so.
seems like that kind of game.
I mean, unless it's doing something groundbreaking that we're not seeing in all the kind of preview
It would be
footage.
really bad for them to not advertise that aspect of the groundbreaking, because right now all of the previews essentially have said that it's like Saints Row 2 and 3
Precisely,
made now, which
precisely.
I want.
Yeah,
Like
I don't.
2 is my favorite by far.
So I don't think that's a bad thing. Yeah. So again, sorry about this, people, but we love tangents on this show. If you don't know, um, you can go back to some of the earlier episodes, and we just go on tangents for like half an hour. Um, but for me, it's that thing of actually Saints Row got a little bit too wacky, right? It went a little bit too far in the end. And what this one looks like is a slightly more grounded version, almost like you said, going back to that Saints Row 2 style where it's a little
Yeah.
bit more grounded but it still has that over the top wacky fun
Yeah,
that
it
Saints Row
seems
is
like it
known
lives
for.
between 2 and 3
Yeah.
essentially
And
somewhere.
also, do you know what? No one can tell me, like, even looking at that game, even if it's bad, I guarantee you it's going to be fun to play with friends. Like, there's
Yeah.
co-op. And I can imagine me and you playing it, Jeff, and we'll just drive a car off a cliff or something.
Oh God. I remember playing Saints Row 2 like crazy online, especially like the insurance fraud thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
absolutely.
so fun.
So
Absolutely. Like yeah, it looks really fun. Like for some apparent reason, my GameStop is selling it at the US price.
oh, okay.
So instead of paying $80, I'm paying 60.
Not gonna complain about that then.
I'll take it. Yeah,
Um
and I've got another couple like codes out and stuff. Like I'm just going to be starting the DLC for the Ascent because they finally fixed the glitch that made me absolutely hate that game.
oh yeah. I ruined that game for Jeff. If you don't
You
know,
did.
I asked him
I
to
joined
join
one
us.
co-op game and it effed me.
It caused a bug that literally destroyed his game. It was
Like, yeah, like I turned it on. I'm like, oh, I have a cyber deck now. Done.
nice,
Fixed. That's fantastic. So, and I played a
nice.
little bit on xCloud just because like I didn't want to
And
download it
you know what the thing is as
just to
well,
test it.
the Ascent when it worked and when it worked
Oh,
well was a great
amazing.
game. It was a great game.
It would have
It
been in my
just
top 10 for sure.
it just had so many technical issues. And then when you add in something like that bug you had, which was literally a game breaking bug.
Yeah, like I couldn't open like any doors or hack anything. It was just annoying. But no, and I got code for Thessia, so I'm interested in trying that out. It's kind of like a Dark Souls kind of game and stuff like that, which looks fantastic.
Nice,
It's
nice.
been getting like decent reviews and stuff too. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, like I said, I'm looking forward to a lot of games. I haven't had as much time to play games right now as I would like. I did play Two Point Campus. I reviewed it over on the outerhaven.net. And I like that game. Don't get me wrong. If you've played Two Point Hospital, I think you'll like it. But for me, it's the fact that it feels like the same game in a different skin. And that's not to say there's nothing different about the game.
yeah, there's lots of quality of life
But
enhancements that really make that game play a lot
yeah.
better.
And that's the thing. Like it's not to say there's nothing different about the game, but for me, it was the thing of I just couldn't get away from when I was playing the game. I feel like I'm playing the same game. And that was slightly negative in it, but it wouldn't have been enough to be negative on its own. But then I
Yeah.
actually had a lot of technical issues prior to launch, which again, none of those were game breaking, but they were noticeable enough to impact my experience. And
Yeah, that
that
was like
was
me and Cult of the Lamb. Like I was playing on pre-release PC build
mm-hmm.
and it was super buggy. A lot of that stuff was fixed. I didn't really have it affect my review too much just
Yeah.
because a lot of it was quick resets and
Yeah.
everything was set.
Yeah, and that was the thing. Like, I've got a very high tolerance for bugs. Like I played Cyberpunk, and granted, I had way less issues than most people, but
Yeah, that was the same with me.
even the issues that I did have weren't enough to really impact or sour my experience. Um, but in Two Point Campus's case, because it was things like menus not allowing me to go down and having to close the menu and open it back up and do that like 3 or 4 times, it was something that would impact the flow of gameplay enough where it would become an annoyance. And when something becomes an annoyance rather than a silly little bug, that's when it starts to impact what I think about the game. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you can obviously go and read my review for yourself. But yes, I still very much liked the game, and I would recommend it to anyone who played Two Point Hospital. It's obviously out there on Game Pass as well. So if you've got Game Pass, there's virtually no barrier to entry for you. So just go and play it and see for yourself. And yeah, other than that, like I said, I'm just looking forward to a few games really. Saints Row's probably going to be the next one. I haven't pre-ordered it yet, but probably at some point over the weekend I will.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe me and you will play some of that, Jeff.
Oh
and
yeah, I'd be
and then
totally down.
when you're on again, we can talk about it. We'll have a little video review episode. But now let's talk about some RPGs, some JRPGs and some Western RPGs, because everyone loves RPGs, right? Like there's an RPG for everybody. And
Oh yeah.
that's kind of how we got onto this topic, is just thinking about the amount of RPGs there are and how varied they are these days. There's a lot of great ones. And if you're not a fan of JRPGs, which I never used to be, there are still great RPG games for you. Um, and if you are a fan of JRPGs, maybe there's some great ones that we'll talk about today that you haven't played yet and that you should check out. So, Jeff, I want you to start, because obviously JRPGs have been around a very, very long time. Western RPGs are a little bit newer in terms of video games.
Yeah.
So what are some of the best JRPGs in your opinion?
Well, I didn't really get into JRPGs until they kind of hit those like either pre-rendered or 3D kind of things. So a lot of the old school stuff, like the old, like Final Fantasy 1 to 6 and all the old Dragon Quest games and stuff like those types of games, I never really got into. They weren't really my thing until something, say, like Final Fantasy 7, which was groundbreaking at the time, right? It was where it kind of gave things a little bit more of a cinematic flair. It changed a lot of things.
It's
Um,
funny to hear you say that, because Final Fantasy VII, the original, if I remember, came out in 1997, correct?
Something
Um,
like that, yeah.
and I was too young to play it. I would have been like 4, maybe 5 at the time, around when people were playing it for that first year of release or
Yeah.
so. Um, so I was too young to play it, right? But I know what that game means to people who played it, and I know what it means for the genre. So I feel like even if I was making a list of JRPGs, it would be on there just for the fact of like, you know, like you said, it was a groundbreaking game. And it
Hmm.
was the game, from what I can tell, it was the game where it pushed JRPGs into the wider audience at the time, where more
It was
people were playing it.
massive too. Like it's one game that I've never beaten. I always get to a certain point, and then I fall off of it. And I've tried replaying it again, but it's just that type of thing where I just couldn't really push past a lot of it. I think it's still a fantastic game.
Nice, nice.
But there's other ones like like 8 I never really got into, even though I know
Mhm.
it's
So,
beloved for a
so
lot
I
of its
get, so I
characters.
guess in a way we could say that your first entry on the list is Final Fantasy itself as a
Yeah,
series.
yeah, because like 8 and 9 I never got into. 10 I watched a friend play pretty much start to finish on that game, so like I know the history on that one. 12 is probably my favorite of the Final Fantasies, just because like its combat system was a bit more open. I just really like that character, really like that game, and everyone always talks about the Star Wars references within Final Fantasy, but like 12 is literally like young blonde kid joins up with like princess of other faction, hunted by person in black armor, joins a smuggler and an animal companion. Like it's Star Wars in every sense of the word. But and then I played like a lot of 11 back in the day. I played a little bit of 14. 15's not too bad. I think it's actually a pretty decent game. But they've all kind of evolved from like turn-based to kind of real time, and the active time battle system into Final Fantasy VII Remake was fantastic. Like that is such a absolutely fantastic experience, and I'm
Is
excited to see the next two entries.
So I want to talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake for a minute because that's a really interesting game to me. Where, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely a JRPG, right? Because of the characters and the world and the story that it's telling. But it seems to be a JRPG that is pushing towards more of a Western RPG style in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like in some respects, I think the real time combat has caught on a lot. I think you're seeing a lot of turn-based stuff kind of follow almost a nostalgia type of experience where things like what Square Enix is doing with like Octopath Traveler and Live Alive and all that kind of
I
stuff,
mean,
where
I mean,
the turn-based is having that look.
turn-based has had a bit of a resurgence, of course, and
Oh, for sure.
we'll talk about a few turn-based games in a while. But for now, I want to bring up my first Western
Sure.
RPG game because I didn't list mine from 5 to 1, anything like that. I just kind
Mine
of
are
have a
never that way. Yeah.
list. I just kind of have a list. So I'm going to bring up one of the best in Witcher 3
Oh
Wild
yeah.
Hunt. Like,
Forget the rest of the list. We have our winner. Yeah, Witcher 3 is
I
fantastic.
feel like I had to bring this one up first because it's the one where if somebody said to me, what even is a Western RPG? I would get them to play Witcher 3. Do you know what I mean? I'd be like, this is
Even
kind
though
of
it's made in Poland.
this is kind of the pinnacle of where a Western RPG can go. And obviously there are other great ones that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but
Yeah.
there was something about this game where it was the first game ever for me where I was playing it and every quest felt important. And even a side quest would feed back into the main quest and you could completely miss it, right? And then that would somehow change your main quest in a certain way. And yes, it's still telling the set story that it's telling, but actually the control you have over the narrative and kind of how certain things play out based on decisions you make and people you interact with and quests you do and all this kind of stuff. That's what makes a great RPG for me. And that is something that, Witcher 3 does amazingly. Just that sense of discovery in the world as well. And I never actually finished Witcher 3 because I had this weird case where I had a corrupted save file
Mm.
after playing like 100 hours of the game. And then it was like, oh, I'm not doing that again. As much as I love it, I'm not doing that again. Um, but it was a special, special game that felt like the point where, for me, Western RPGs almost, we're framing this as a little bit of a war, Western RPG versus JRPG. And it's all in good fun, of course. But
Mhm.
Witcher 3 to me felt like the point where maybe Western RPGs became the pinnacle of RPGs in general. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, like I mean, Witcher 3 had a lot of, I think, you take a look at something like Assassin's Creed now, and with Origins, they adopted the Witcher 3 formula for how it was going. So, like, Origins and Odyssey and Valhalla, they are what they are because of The Witcher 3.
yeah.
And I think a lot of games are going that way as well too. Because like The Witcher 3, like it's not just an open world, it's an open world that feels alive and lived in, and like there are open plains for sure, but there's so much interest everywhere in that map, whether from small subquests that you're just doing to side quests like the Bloody Baron, which
Mhm.
is an amazing quest.
Yeah.
That game is just fantastic in what it does, and I think
Uh,
it's because
and then the
they.
other thing is, we didn't even talk about the DLC, right? Of how
Oh
they
yeah,
expanded
Blood and
that
Stone,
game,
and
and they basically made other games inside of a game. It wasn't just, oh, have some more content. It was almost a full on other game. Like they went far with it because they knew what they were doing, right? They hit a formula. They hit a formula which wasn't formulaic, and for open world RPG game, that's astounding. Really, like
yeah,
that
like
doesn't happen.
he wasn't climbing some type of like castle tower and then looking out into the distance and icon, 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 icon. Like it wasn't that garbage.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. So speaking of games like that, are there any JRPGs that were kind of like that for their genre, where they were so impactful that they changed what a JRPG is in some ways?
I think that, I mean, I think Final Fantasy VII was kind of where it changed because everything from that point forward went cinematic in that respect. They weren't just
Okay.
top-down 2D sprite kind of games.
So
One that
outside of Final Fantasy though, like after Final Fantasy 7, where would you say was the next point that the genre moved forward or did something that maybe you didn't expect?
Oh God, I don't know.
Interesting. Interesting.
They've kind of kept that same formula. Like, I would say like some of the later games in that series where they started adopting like full 3D backgrounds and all that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. I think when games started to go full 3D as opposed to like not pre-rendered backgrounds, which
Yeah,
is all Final
it
Fantasy
made
VII was.
differences to what they could do, right?
Yeah,
When
I
you
mean the
go full
hardware has
3D.
always pushed that.
For sure.
I think like one franchise to me that has made that jump from 2D to 3D to changing how everything works is probably my favorite JRPG franchise in regards to one that's been around for a very, very long time, and that's the Legends of Heroes series. There's like a
Okay,
dozen games.
that's
There's
actually
like,
not one that I'm familiar with. So
yeah,
please elaborate.
yeah, so like Legends of Heroes has been around for a very, very long time. I mean, there's entries on like the PSP, there's some entries on PC. Um, it's really got a lot of recent exposure with the Trails of Cold Steel series, which is like 3 and 4 are perfect games for me. They are fantastic. They are 10 out of 10 games for me. They are utterly amazing. That cast of characters, the story, the combat, everything's fantastic. Really looking forward to more of them. They're starting to bring out some of the older games out again because there's been different publishers throughout some entries and newer ones. But the Legends of Heroes series is a franchise that if you have not played, I I strongly suggest jumping into them. They are Trials of Cold Steel 3 is the JRPG equivalent of Infinity War, and Trails of Cold Steel 4 is the equivalent of Endgame, and that is
I mean, this is
because
some big claims that you're making.
Legends of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 literally has every character practically from the Legends of Heroes series.
Oh wow, okay.
Like it is like, I'm not even kidding when I say it's endgame. It is literally like they took all these different because like each one has been a different arc. So they've been building all this stuff up, and Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4 are the epitome of building that up.
Wow, that actually sounds really unusual for video games in general. Like we don't see video games often spend that time to build
Yeah.
something up and then
And it's
have
one
the
of the only
payoff.
series where it continues in an arc. None of the Final Fantasies connect to one another unless they're spin-offs like the
Mhm.
Lightning games. Whereas Legends of Heroes, you have that with Ys as well too, YS,
Yeah.
where it's the same basic characters, but you also reshuffle the deck every single time, and those games are told out of sequence. So you
Okay.
have, the main character and stuff, but the people around him always change. Whereas with Legends of Heroes, you're playing those games and you're like, oh, hey, I remember them from the Crossbell series. I remember them from this series. Like, it's one of the only JRPGs that are the first game and the 15th or whatever we're at right now. They're all in the same world. Every one of them.
It's nice. Well, for my next entry on the list, I would like to bring up a game that I think, you know, we can have a debate whether this game is the best game in its series and all this kind of stuff. But I do think it's undoubtable that this was the game where kind of people started to actually pay attention to Western RPGs
I think
and
I know which one you're talking about.
and I would say this game had a lot of influence on Witcher 3 as well in many ways. What game do you think I'm talking about, Jeff?
Hold on, let me grab it.
Okay, Jeff's got a little thing here to show us. Yes, but which one, Jeff? Which one?
I'm gonna say you're talking about 3.
Yes, because Fallout 3 was this moment, right, where Bethesda took a game that was in the first two games a very different style of game, and it was still an RPG, but it was, a top-down RPG and very, very different. And they made it first person, open world,
Yeah.
kind of, yes, the shooting was garbage, and that's why VATS existed. But this game was like, I don't know, it was a moment, right? And I talk about that a lot when we make these kind of lists, but this game was just a moment in time where it felt like something special. And there were others around that sort of time as well. Another one that kind of is on my list, but I don't know if I was going to bring it up or not, so I'll bring it up now. And that is Mass Effect. Like you got Mass Effect 1, Mass Effect 2. The third game, I'm sure people kind of are up and down on, but those games were a similar kind of thing. But Fallout 3 felt like it literally shaped the direction of an entire company, which then shaped the direction of a genre, which has then gone on to affect the industry in a wider sense, right? Like, we talk about things like Oblivion. Obviously, Bethesda made Oblivion as well, and people love Oblivion.
Mm-hmm.
Then they had Fallout 3. Then they go on to make Skyrim. But I don't think that something like Skyrim is what it is without them making Fallout 3. Because I think that if you look at the differences between Skyrim and Oblivion, there's a lot of Fallout DNA in the design choices they made with Skyrim compared to what they did with Oblivion. And I just think Fallout, you can say what you will about the series in general, and obviously the fourth game came out, and many people, myself included, were very much like, oh, this is just Fallout 3 but looks a bit better, and they kind of added a few things that people modded in anyway.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take away from what people people will never quite understand how hard it is to take an existing franchise and completely change it while still trying to keep it within the same genre, even if it isn't the same subgenre within that genre,
Yeah.
right?
And even then, people who want that old series, Wasteland continued, and it kind of delivered that as well.
Absolutely. So for me, yeah, Fallout 3, and some people would say Fallout New Vegas, but I think the reason I go with 3, even though I actually prefer New Vegas as a game personally,
Yeah.
3 was where it started, right? And to me, that is what makes it even more special, is that sense of discovery in that world was amazing. And being able to go in somewhere and read a note and feel like you knew these people. Do you know what I mean? Like these people became more than video game characters. They became people, because you'd read about their lives and then you might meet them later, or you might kill someone by accident and then you don't get that quest anymore, and all this kind of stuff that could happen. And at least for me at the time, that was things that didn't happen in video
Yeah.
games.
It also like popularized a lot of the like starting in a location and then opening up a door to a big open world. Like, everyone talks about the vault moment, whether it was like the personalized radio stations as well too. Like there's a lot of that stuff, because like whenever anybody hears like some old like music like that, they're like, oh yeah, that's like Fallout music.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, if I was to be critical of Fallout 3, it would just be that the for the type of game they were making, the shooting needed to be better, right? But at the same time, they created this very RPG like system with VATS, where
Mm-hmm.
it was like target a body part, and based on positioning and all these kind of things, you have a percentage of whether you'll be successful in your shot or not. And actually, that made it even more of an RPG to me, because it was like, okay, the shooting actually has an RPG system. So it's not just an action game with RPG kind of aspects and elements pushed into it. It literally is an RPG
Yeah.
game.
There was
And
a JRPG that had body targeting for its combat system called Vagrant Story, which
okay.
was amazing on the PlayStation 1.
So I've heard of this game, but I never played it. So that's good to know. That's and
Um,
I'm not, and again, I'm not saying that Fallout 3 was the first game to do that body
yeah.
targeting system, but to do that in a game which essentially was a first person shooter in terms of its basic mechanic,
Mm-hmm.
I actually think was really clever. Even though, yes, they were doing it to kind of help fix the fact that their first person mechanics in terms of shooting weren't great, it still fit within the style of game they were making, and it didn't
Mm-hmm.
feel out of place. And actually, even as their shooting has improved slightly, with Fallout 4 has been better with the shooting, and then for even Fallout 76, if you played that, I'm not saying it's a first person shooter level of how good it is, but it's better, right? They've improved it. But the thing is, they've still kept that system because it fits within the style of game. So
Yeah.
even if the shooting was great, I would still want the VAT system, um, personally. And yeah, I just loved playing it. It was just one of those games that I loved playing it. It felt like the first game, because I must have been around, I don't know, 13 or 14 at the time. And it was the first game that I remember outside of a GTA game where everyone was playing it, where
Yeah.
everyone stopped and this is the game they were playing. And if you weren't playing it, you were kind of the odd one out, right? Like it
Yeah,
it
it did really well.
it was amazing. And credit to them, because like I said, kind of adjusting a franchise in that way, a franchise that was beloved by people even before the third game, isn't an easy task. And they did it in a way where they made it their own, right? Like we now think when we think of Fallout now, nobody really thinks of those first two games anymore. They think about Fallout 3 onwards because that is what Fallout is.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah, credit to them. I think they made an amazing RPG. And, you know, I'm not saying that was one of the first Western RPGs, but it was certainly an early one, right? Like in terms of what we think of as a Western RPG now, that was one of the early ones, and they did a terrific job, I think. And I think you can see that in the sense of every Fallout game since then has essentially emulated what that is and just improved on it. Mm-hmm. And that's a sign of a very, very good game. So, you know.
Oh, for sure.
What about some more JRPGs, Jeff? What have you got for us?
Yeah, I'll skip through a couple here. Like you get some of them that kind of were like one and done, which were unfortunate. Things like Legend of Dragoon for PlayStation, which there's always been rumors of it coming back. I think there was like some tweet a couple weeks ago from one of the composers or something like that. The Grandia series has been fantastic as well. I love Grandia 3, despite it being the least liked of the entire series. That one was really good. Star Ocean's coming back later in this year. I think they make an entry almost like every 7 years, so it's not a very saturated JRPG, even if this one here looks okay. I think it looks fine. I don't think it looks like it's going to set the world on fire, especially with this year's releases still to come out. Persona 5 is another one that was extremely mainstream for, I think, a lot of its appeal. The music was fantastic. The characters were really good. I know when the characters got announced for Smash, that was massive. And now it's coming to Xbox in a couple months, I think. It's going to be
October the 20-something, of October it is.
Persona, like I had played, I had dabbled a little bit in Persona before, like the Shin Megami Tensei series that it spun off from. I never really was into. I tried playing the latest one for Switch, and I played about 12 or 13 hours of it, and I just kind of fell off of it. And Persona 5, however, was a game that I really liked. Strikers, the Warriors spin-off, was superb. It was so good. And Persona 5 Royale was kind of like a director's cut for that game that just made everything better. It had a lot of quality of life updates that were fantastic. I think it's going to be very, very tough for them to make Persona 6 and not have everyone constantly thinking of 5. I think that's how beloved 5 was. But 4 was beloved as well, too.
4 was the same, right? And they also did that same thing with 4, where they did Persona 4 Golden, right? And that was an improved version of the original game. So yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. And I've actually never played a Persona game, so I'm looking forward to, I will be jumping in on Persona 5 when it joins Game Pass, because I actually almost purchased it, and then I decided to wait because there were obviously rumblings that it might come to Game Pass, and I almost purchased it 2 days before that announcement.
I have the steelbooks for like each version of 5, and I've still yet to actually beat it.
Nice.
Despite Strikers being a sequel. No, it's just one of those things where it's like, these are 140-hour RPGs, and you really, really have to do something special for me to be able to like stick with it. And it just, when Persona 5 came out, there was so much stuff. And like, even with Xenoblade, like, my review is probably going to go up like a month after that game comes out. Just because like it's so beloved for me. Like, it's one of those games where it's like, I'm not rushing. Because like, I've seen the 70-hour, like, I streamlined the story for the review, and I'm like, that is the worst way to play that game.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So obviously we could talk all day about JRPGs, Western RPGs. I do want to get to a little bit of news, which kind of feels
Sure.
something we're going to try and be adding in here. But before we do that, I'd like to know that two questions for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
One is, if you had to choose one JRPG as the best JRPG of all time, in your opinion, which would it be? And then two is, what style of RPG is actually your personal favorite? Is it JRPG? Is it Western RPG? Or is it a different type of RPG game?
Well, I mean, like, it'll vary because, like, when you take a look at Western RPG, Witcher 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. But every other type of Western RPG doesn't even, I think, quantify in that same type of
Interesting.
in that rating. Because, like,
There's one that I'm going to bring up in a minute, and we'll see what you think.
yeah, because, like, Mass Effect, I absolutely love that series. I think they're fantastic. The Fallout games I've enjoyed. I have not ever loved them. And you'll get other ones like the Elder Scrolls games, which I have enjoyed, and so on and so forth. Witcher 3 is still one of the best games ever made.
I'd agree.
I would think in terms of which one that I would prefer, I would almost say JRPG, because most Western RPGs tend to follow a very similar formula, where JRPGs can go from regular formula to like batshit crazy in terms of like everything it does, and they feel, I think, sometimes a lot more unique.
That's
Like,
interesting, because my issue with JRPGs for many, many years was always that I felt like they were all the same game. And what I mean by that is, they had a lot of character tropes, they had a lot of story tropes, or at least
mhm.
the ones that I tried, where it felt like each game was actually telling the same story, but with slightly different characters
Yeah, I
and
had
different
that with
mechanics.
a game, I don't know, 2 years ago. I can't remember, with Dragon Quest 11, and
Okay.
then there was another game that came out after, which was a remake of one of the original games. It was something of Mana. I can't remember what it was, but it was a 3D style one, and it was
Okay.
literally the same story.
Oh, wow.
Like, I'm not even kidding. I'm literally not even kidding. It was like evil. It's like people come together, magic sword, yada yada yada. Like, it was literally the exact same story, and that was a remake. So 11, Dragon Quest 11 ripped off that story.
Wow. Wow.
Um, like, the Dragon Quest games are fantastic. Like, the
Mhm.
art design is great. You got the
Yeah.
Dragon Ball guy, but
I think it's, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to put down the genre, because I think it's
yeah,
true of any genre. There are tropes in every single genre, and there are certain things that happen all the time, right? And it's like, people look at Ubisoft games, and we won't talk too much about Ubisoft, but Ubisoft do certain things in their games every time, because that is their style of game. And I think every genre of game has the same thing. But something that put me off of JRPGs for a long time, as someone who cares about story and cares about characters, was I could never connect with the story and characters, either because they felt like they were telling the same story that I'd heard 1,000 times,
mhm.
or because they were so kind of batshit crazy that they were just completely unrelatable. And then I played Yakuza Like a Dragon, which of
Yeah,
course is a big change for that series. It went turn based, and it became about as much of a JRPG as you can be, right?
mhm.
Um, to the point where it actually talks about other JRPGs in the
Yeah. Dragon
game.
Quest is like his fascination. Like, he sees all that stuff.
Yeah. So, and that was where it really turned for me, because it was like, oh, okay, there can be different stories in this genre, and they can have tropey characters that are still interesting and still have their own unique things about them, even though they're based on a trope that we've seen before, right? Um, so that was kind of a turning point with me, and the JRPG genre. So it's interesting to hear you say that for you, it was actually the other way where you feel like they're more different in terms of kind of
Yeah, I
characters and
mean, because
story.
like you get your turn based and you get your action stuff where it's like real time battles, and I prefer the real time stuff, even though like Xenoblade Chronicles, for example, has like an auto attack type of thing. So your special attacks of the stuff you're pulling off in real time. Like in terms of like my absolute favorites, like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, 3, Grandia 3, Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4, and Final Fantasy 12 are like probably my favorite JRPGs.
Nice,
And
nice.
like I love them all for different reasons. I definitely prefer the more real time stuff. Like the turn based stuff is fine. I don't mind it
Mhm.
depending on the game. I think it just depends on the pacing of a lot of story aspects because JRPGs have generally a very slow start. But Xenoblade Chronicles 3, for example, it starts right from the beginning and
Interesting.
it
Okay.
just goes. Like 2 takes a couple hours to kind of, get into and stuff like that. But I just love like I always never consider myself the JRPG guy until I look back and realize I kind of am a JRPG guy. Like it's one of those franchises or genres, sorry, that I never feel I play that many until I look at my list and I'm like, oh no, yeah, I have played a lot. But I generally move away from a lot of the older stuff now, like the 2D stuff, like the things like Octopath Traveler and that kind of look. I've
Mhm.
kind of moved away from it. It doesn't interest me anymore. The old school
Is
looking
there
JRPGs.
because I've got a similar, so I've got a friend who JRPGs used to be probably his favorite genre.
Yeah,
I would say, and he's a bit older than me, but now he actually hardly plays JRPGs, and many of the ones that he has tried, he doesn't really enjoy, or
yeah.
they don't grab him enough. Um, so what is so hearing you say that you've kind of moved away from that old style because they don't interest you anymore,
Hmm.
what is it that kind of made you not interested in that style? Because that's a game and that is a style that you used to like, right? So is there something in particular that they're
Well,
not doing anymore,
yes and
or
no, because like I never really was into a lot of the old school JRPGs and stuff, like the old stuff.
mm,
So you get like the first couple like Star Oceans and Final Fantasies and stuff. That never really caught me until they started doing the 3D stuff or the
okay,
pre-rendered background stuff. So like I've tried like Octopath Traveler I think is a fine game. I think it is super fun, but it's also a genre that doesn't do a lot for me to get me
it, ha-
excited to
it
jump
has a
into it.
style
Whereas,
it has a style that doesn't speak to you. It is
yeah,
what you're
like
saying,
when you
really.
have when you have real-time combat in 3D and big open worlds and stuff, it gets me excited. You'll
Yeah.
get stuff like the Sword Art Online games. I mean, hell, I've got a Sword Art poster right next to me here. Like, I love the franchise. I hate the games. Like Project Alicization, or however you want to pronounce it, was garbage. Absolute garbage. And this is an anime that's based on playing the popular game at the time, and they have yet to make a game that has really been fantastic.
That's
And
interesting.
you'll get something like I'm excited to play the next Star Ocean, even though I think it looks average,
Mhm.
because I'm hoping for something to be really really good out of it, and
Yeah, that
like
will
I'll
grab
buy
you,
all
right?
of
You want something to
yeah,
grab you.
and like the Tales of games, like Tales of Arise was great, Vesperia, like Besteria, like all those games are super fun. I love playing them because again, the combat systems are
Mhm.
super fun. Same with East. Like when they make another one of those games, I'll be set for that. I don't think I'm gonna play the mobile one, but real-time combat JRPGs are my jam. I
And
absolutely love
you'll get
them.
all of these things, and I'll be sat here still waiting for Fallout 5.
Yeah,
that's what
2015, look,
that's
or
what's gonna
2025 or whatever it's gonna be.
I mean,
I
yeah,
can't
that
believe they announced that.
I know this is a weird one, but I do want to. So I want to move on to a little bit of news to kind of end the episode.
Sure.
Um, and it feels a little bit appropriate if you haven't been paying attention to the news recently. Obviously, one of the best RPG games probably ever made is KOTOR. Would you not agree, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, like I enjoyed playing a lot of it when it first came out, like way back in the day. Um, it
Yeah.
was a very different type of game because it had that almost auto attack type of thing where you just set the motion and you go. And oddly enough, I never played much of the second one. I think I played a couple hours, but
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, but obviously, if you may have seen that KOTOR is getting a remake, and it was going to be at least some sort of exclusivity over on PlayStation. And it sounds like they've had a troubled development. There was a report that the game's been put on pause and all these kind of things. And then there's been some news recently and some reports that the studio making the game has actually changed. And I can't remember which studio it is right now. I'd have to look it up.
Saber Interactive.
There you go. Thank you, Jeff. But Saber is very good, but it's going to be interesting to see them take on something like KOTOR because
Especially with that comment of like they're not expecting a delay. And
yeah.
I'm like,
Oh yeah. What
you
are
have
you?
a whole new team taking on, I mean, they were already familiar with the project and stuff, but taking over the entire game and going from where they were.
And also taking over a beloved game, right? Like KOTOR is absolutely one of the most beloved RPGs ever, regardless of
Yeah.
what kind of RPG we're talking about. And it's a big task to kind of remake this game or remaster this game or whatever they're doing with it. It's a big task regardless. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, with the comment of they're not expecting a delay and it should still
And there would
release.
have to be a delay, right? Because if they didn't like what they were seeing before and they
Yeah.
have to
And I mean, they've
scrap some
paused
of it.
development, right? So they've
Yeah.
lost
So
development
obviously
time.
they have to rebuild like large like
Mm-hmm.
brushstrokes of this game because
I mean,
and it's not even
or maybe it is that they just believe in Saber so much that they think Saber can get it done in the same amount of
yeah.
time. Maybe because Saber is very good. Saber is very good at what they do, and they would be one of my underrated studios. If you were to kind of ask
Yeah.
me in terms of underrated developers, they would be one of them. Um, but yeah, I mean, that was, I just felt like that was an appropriate bit of news that to our topic today. Let us know some of the JRPGs and Western RPGs that you've played. What are your favorites in each of those subgenres, if you will? And also, which do you prefer, JRPG or Western RPG? Because obviously, there are many, many choices. And I think one thing this discussion today has kind of pointed out to me is JRPGs have been around a lot longer and they've done many, many more things. And they've kind of been through a lot more iterations in terms of what their own genre is. Whereas Western RPG is still quite young, really, in video game terms. Western RPGs have maybe been around for 15, most 20 years in terms of what we think about as a Western RPG today. And they haven't been through that many changes yet. Like Jeff was saying earlier, they follow a lot of the same design principles. They don't really try too much different, and that's not a bad thing in many ways, but they
Yeah,
haven't.
they'll change some little things and stuff, yeah, but
Yeah.
like either third person or first person or but I mean the combat is generally
Yeah.
somewhat similar.
And of course, if you made a list of best Western RPGs, that list is going to be shorter than best JRPGs because there are more JRPGs just for the fact that they've been around so much longer, right? So that's why we felt like we should put these two together just to kind of have this overall discussion about how good RPGs are and how hopefully you'll see that some of the kind of examples we've given you today, things like Fallout 3 or things like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, they're so different, but they're actually within the same overall genre, but then they take their own spin on it, which makes them a subgenre, right? and even within their subgenre, they then have spins on that. So it's RPG is a strange genre to talk about because it's so deep, like many of the games, and we could spend hundreds of hours talking about them because they're great. Like, these games are great and they do many, many things so well. And that's why we see other games that aren't classified as RPGs stealing not stealing RPG mechanics, but borrowing those mechanics and implementing them into different styles of games because those mechanics are cool, right? And that's one thing I was actually saying earlier is really, when we think about it, what an RPG game is different to every person, because what an RPG game really means is a role-playing game, and the actual design aspects of that in terms of leveling and all these kind of things aren't anything to do with RPG. Like, they are just design elements and they can be used in any game ever, right? But what makes an RPG for me at least, and Jeff, you can answer this question in a moment, but for me, what makes an RPG is either a use of all those mechanics in a collective way, or a use of many of those mechanics, or certainly on the Western side, I think it is the freedom of exploration and the control over the narrative and how you shape that narrative as the player, because you are the character. And that's the difference between an RPG and an action adventure game, something like Horizon Forbidden West. Like, could you technically say that Horizon Forbidden West is a Western RPG? In some ways, probably, because it takes a lot of inspiration from Witcher 3, for example. But it is still a very it's very set in its ways as an open world action adventure game. But again, that plays into exactly what I'm talking about how this discussion around RPGs is something that could go on for ages, because RPG means something slightly different to every person. Some people classify Zelda as an RPG game. I personally don't, but I understand why people think that way about it.
Yeah, I don't think there's clear guidelines on what makes a game an RPG.
Absolutely.
Because essentially it's just a role-playing game. You're taking on a role. I mean, NHL 2023 is an RPG.
You're technically taking on a role, right?
Yeah. You're taking on a role.
I think the only thing that does is this idea that RPG comes from D&D, right? And in D&D, you play as a character and you're leveling, you're having skills and all this stuff. And this is where, when we translate that to video games, that is what these RPG games became. But really what D&D is you playing a role. Ultimately, you're still playing a role. So that is all RPG actually means. And I think that's why it's so broad. And I think it's become more broad over time because of how many games now use these elements of design that we would consider RPG elements of design, because they first showed up in that genre of game, right? But yeah, I don't know. Genres are messy, as we've discussed before. Genres are messy. So let us know, actually. This is a really good question. Is there a game out there that maybe isn't widely considered an RPG game, but you yourself would consider it as an RPG
Power Wash
game?
Simulator. Greatest Western RPG of them all.
Oh my god. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Obviously, check out Jeff over on analogstickgaming.com, and his Twitter links will be below. What are those, Jeff?
So the website is at Analog STK Gaming. You can also find me at Necromancer on Twitter. That's with a K at the beginning instead of a C. Other than that, analogstickgaming.com. I should have a review out, I think, next week. I gotta take a look at the embargo details, but
nice. And I mean, even if Jeff doesn't have a new review out, there are many good reviews over there.
It's another JRPG.
He spoke about Cult of the Lamb and things like that.
Cult of the Lamb, that one's been posted. That one's up and going. I got a review code for that. So thank you to Devolver Digital for that fella.
And Jeff will be back in a few weeks, and depending on what happens with Saints Row, maybe we'll have a Saints Row review episode for you. Because Jeff's not back for about 2 weeks now, so we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, because that's out in 4 days.
Yeah.
So I got to burn through Xenoblade Chronicles and Dynastia.
Jeff's got a lot of things to play. I've got a lot of things to do. Obviously follow us over on at G4A Network. That is our new kind of Twitter handle because, as you know, and if you don't know, we're now more than a podcast, right? We're a network. Jeff is part of our network. He has his site where he does reviews and he hosts the podcast with me twice a month. And at some point, we're going to have a new channel where we get together to sometimes talk about movies and that kind of thing. Because we want to just branch out a bit here. But if you're into gaming and gaming is your thing, follow at Eat Sleep Game on Twitter, because that is obviously where our YouTube episodes post over on the Eat Sleep Game channel on YouTube. So subscribe there, because that is Luke, the old co-host of the podcast, who may pop up here and now. Sometimes. Maybe next week. Maybe you might see Luke next week if you subscribe. But he does a lot of cool videos as well and playthroughs over on his channel. So if you're here for the gaming, at Eat Sleep Game on Twitter is where you want to follow. And then you can also find us on twitch.tv/G4A Live, where I will be doing some live streams soon. I'm not sure which game yet. Maybe I'll live stream some Saints Row and Jeff will be in co-op with me and we'll have some fun on a live stream doing that maybe. But who knows? So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode and we will see you next time. Jeff will see you in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
See you guys.